George, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So from your perspective, George, what's the biggest way the health and fitness world is potentially letting men down mentally from your perspective?
I couldn't give you a way in which the health and fitness world is letting men down, but I would say we're all letting men down as a society by not taking seriously men's health and how bad it's gotten, like worse and worse and worse. Like in more or less every metric you could possibly think of, men are behind women in terms of health and life expectancy, and no one seems to be talking about it. So I wouldn't want to single out the health and fitness industry beyond that, because it's something that we've all failed to see, and that we all seem to think that men have it great in every single possible way, and it's women's health that's underfunded, but it's not true anymore. So I think it's a bigger failure than just the health and fitness world, I think.
Yeah, I believe it is as well. I think from working so closely in it and working a lot with different men's mental health charities, it's just good to see from other people's perspective maybe what work the health and fitness industry is doing to help with men's mental health. It's obviously a huge contributor to men feeling better, having purpose, and having something that they can work towards where they see change pretty quickly from a direct sweat equity going into the day-to-day life. But there's some things obviously with every space that can be a bit toxic. I think some people pitch the gym as their therapy, and it's the only thing that they'll use in order to be proactive with protecting their own mental health.
Well, there's the emerging problem of bigorexia, although I'd even argue it's not an emerging problem. It's been around for a long time, but it's only emerging into our consciousness. And bigorexia is a type of eating disorder or body dysmorphic disorder where it's the opposite of anorexia. It's like the need to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's obviously very prevalent in bodybuilding and gym culture in general. Not talked about enough. It overwhelmingly impacts men, surprisingly. And it's really dangerous. It's getting younger and younger and younger. More and more young boys are being pushed towards like these really difficult to achieve body images based on like being hypermuscular, and a lot of it is physically impossible to attain. Like we always I think about the celebrity sort of muscular men like Henry Cavill, Hugh Jackman, Wolverine. And if you look at, I always look at Wolverine through the ages because he's been with us for like 25 years. And if you look at the original Wolverine from the original X-Men, he is just like a big buff dad. He's like a pretty attainable body type, big, but not like sculpted. And then you look at the next X-Men and then the Wolverine films. And then over the years, he becomes so unbelievably impossibly to achieve muscular to the point where to achieve that, Hugh Jackman has to dehydrate his body for 3 days before filming, where he drinks limited amounts of water and then no water for days on end. So the skin sits on his muscle. And Henry Cavill did the same for 3 days before filming The Witcher. He had to not have any water to the point where he would talk about being able to smell water. Like he was so dehydrated he could smell water on set. So it's not that I don't want to encourage men to be the best they can physically, but a lot of the time the archetypes we're looking at on TV are just not achievable unless you're willing to dehydrate yourself for 3 days, which obviously you should definitely not do. So I wouldn't blame the fitness industry for that, but it's certainly an area of men's health that I think they're particularly vulnerable to, that should be talked about a lot more. And bigorexia is the name that people are talking about more and more and more. And which is obviously a very good thing.
Yeah, you brought up an interesting topic there, George, as well, in terms of even, the pin-up boy of the male superhero and the way that he's evolved in just the form of Wolverine. And then we obviously have in the opposite direction the female Disney princesses and characters who at one point were, waist you could probably put your hands around, and then across the chest area and through the hips and waist, they were a lot more hourglass figure, and it was hugely over-exaggerated. But it seems like even with those characters, they've moved in a different direction. Even, with stuff like Moana, and I think there was another movie called Encanto where they had the much bigger female characters within those. But it looks like the male pin-up boy is definitely moved more to the extreme, whereas it feels that at least within inside of the Disney realm, we have the opposite effect with the female characters.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good work has been done in terms of setting up achievable body images for women within like Disney films and sort of blockbusters and Marvel and etc. However, the way in which I think female superheroes are let down is that they are so boring. Because as a filmmaker myself, I think the best characters are ones that are fundamentally flawed or have some sort of problem. Like if you think about Iron Man, he's a narcissist, he has anxiety issues. You have Thor, who is like overweight and an alcoholic. You have Captain America, who is like kind of a funny duddy sort of old man sort of character. Everything, and you have every single male superhero has some sort of personality defect that actually makes them look like very lovable and relatable. However, whenever you look at the female superheroes, I guess Captain Marvel is like the best example. I think writers are so afraid to write any sort of flaw into a female archetypal hero that they has the opposite effect, and you're basically writing female heroes that are just so dull and boring and unrelatable and unlikable. That's how we've led ourselves down this road where Marvel's essentially clapped around its own ears. And so although we've done a lot of work in terms of creating stronger body images for women in superhero films, I feel like there's a lot of work to be done within their personalities, which are just completely sanitized of any sort of blemish, sort of the opposite problem.
Yeah, well, I guess that's why Marvel's also done a shit dive off a cliff in terms of just how the brand's doing over the past couple of years. Anyways, that's direct correlation, I think, with those.
Yeah. It's dreadful. Yeah. I think that's a big part of it.
I think even with with men's body dysmorphia in general, it's looked at differently. I see, especially even in the fitness space, how that dynamic works for both men and women. But I think it's definitely on the rise. I think for men who have maybe never been judged to be too bothered about their bodies, or it's never been as much of a thing for men to be worried about their bodies or what other people think or what society thinks. But it seems to be just emerging, especially within the groups that I've witnessed as well, in some of the men's groups that I've held on weekends.
Well, I'm doing a post at the minute about eating disorders in men, and how it's interesting about twice as many women living with an eating disorder around the world. However, the men who have eating disorders are more than twice as likely to die as a result. So eating disorders has a much higher risk to a man's mortality. However, it impacts about half the amount of people. And there's lots to say about it, but basically the research around eating disorders overwhelmingly centers on women. I think it's about between 90 and 99% of study participants in clinical trials for eating disorders have been women. So obviously men who have eating disorders just fall through the cracks, and they're about 30% of all of those impacted. And one of the reasons people say that there's a high mortality rate in men with eating disorders is because we don't see it in them, we don't recognize it in them, and it means they get diagnosed later and they get supported later and the interventions come later, by which point it is too late, and that's why they die at such enormously high rates. So I think the fact that we don't see it as often in men, and the fact that they die a lot more with eating disorders, those two are sort of intrinsically linked and cause of one another. But then that is part of a changing trend where there is more research to how eating disorders present in men, and it's prevalent. I get contacted all the time by men with these sort of conditions. I have friends who I believe have eating disorders, and it's so extraordinarily dangerous. And we talk a lot about how women were left behind in healthcare, and certain studies were done on men's bodies, and I can debate that later if you like. But when it comes to eating disorders, it's undeniable that the vast majority of research has been done on how it presents in women, and it's leading to many men dying totally needlessly. And I think that's actually true for a lot of areas of health now.
Yeah, I think it's the view maybe from on men, by women, in terms of how men's eating disorders are viewed. I remember even when I was younger and growing up within the more extreme bodybuilding world, and eating and spitting out food just so you could taste it and not consume the calories would be, you know, clapped or rewarded by friends because it was like, oh no, he's grinding, he's getting it in, he's doing what it takes. Whereas it's literally an eating disorder. And I think even a lot of the fitness space is just, you know, glorified anorexia or glorified eating disorders until people get abs. And I think that's why a lot of the time it's not even looked as an eating disorder, because it's just a means for you to be as lean as possible and take on some of these strategies and tactics like Hugh Jackman or like the Henry Cavill from The Witcher, and Henry Cavill. And even, you know, you hear the Brad Pitt cycle come up, which puts even more pressure on things for young men and makes them view it in a different dynamic.
Well, it's like my whole job is basically balancing acts between how do I present these ideas in a way that is most resonant of people, makes the most sense. And when it comes to body image within men, that's one of the balancing acts that I'm still trying to get right, and I don't think I have, because there's two sides to it. There's a side that you just mentioned where we're glorifying eating disorders in a way that, you know, guys are chewing food and spitting it out, and people are like, yeah, well done, you're grinding. But at the same time, on the opposite end, there's the more female-centric view of body positivity, which is about glorifying unhealthy bodies in the opposite way, where it's about normalizing obesity, which shouldn't be done. I remember I did a post years ago where I basically presented a CGI generated image of the most average man in America. Said this man has the average height and average BMI, average weight, and he was obviously overweight and like slightly obese. And I put that up as a way of saying this is what a normal man looks like. And all of the comments, 90% of them were like, we don't think this is right. We don't think we should be normalizing this body type. We think men should do better. Like, it's important to look at what the average body type is, but not as a means of accepting it, but as a means of saying, this is what we should be getting beyond this. Like, we should be hustling. We should be pushing beyond that. We shouldn't be saying it's a normal thing. And men should be going back into the gym and exercise and eating better. And I agree. I think that's fair as well. So I've sort of identified the boundaries of where it's wrong, but exactly where that line is, I don't quite know yet. But I think the way men want to talk about body positivity is slightly different to the way women already talk about it. And I think I've got a lot to learn, to be honest, about how to get that balance right, because I've clearly got it wrong before. And I'm still trying to find out where that sweet spot is, where we're not normalizing eating disorders, but we're also not normalizing unhealthy body types either.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is sometimes with the body positivity movement is that it's often putting a plaster over a wound, but then what happens with especially a lot of more so female creators, because it's more popular in that space, is that, you know, they show up with these posts and comments and they get, you know, thousands of likes and extreme validation from people. So that individual then continues as like a performer on stage to show up as this different character who's now body positivity, and takes that more and more extreme, because the more extreme she takes it, the more validation she gets. And then eventually these people just lose themselves because they just become that character and slowly pull away from themselves. So even that side to the body positivity movement is quite dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a lot to say about the women's body positivity movement, and how, although we should be talking about how we shouldn't be shaming anyone's body, no matter what it looks like. But at the same time, there is such a thing as an unhealthy body, and like all unhealthy habits that shouldn't be normalized. And we should be encouraging people to move beyond that and improve upon it.
Yeah. What do you think that we're getting wrong then in terms of men speaking out and getting the support? Because I know from personal experience, and again, it's not pulling directly from data, but there's a lot more guys speaking to me online. There's a lot more guys speaking about, you know, especially eating disorders in different spaces as well. But what are we lacking in terms of then past that point in the services that are being missed for men? Because we keep telling men to speak more and speak to people, but I believe that they are.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just you that believes that they are. The research shows that they are in quite high numbers. I mean, we are well aware through sort of feminist campaigning that workplaces and industries that are disproportionately employing men benefit other men, because those men are sort of creating work environments and sort of tools and frameworks that are male-centric. But if you look at the psychological industry and therapy in particular, about 80% of therapists are women. and the tools in which they're developing are more suitable for other women. So it's frustrating how we've taken this critical view of male-dominated workplaces, but we're not willing to reverse that and look at the psychological industry as a way of understanding why do so few men go to therapy, or why do the men who go to therapy so often drop out. And there has been research has tried to answer that question, and the results won't surprise you, but essentially half the men that drop out of therapy said they didn't connect to the therapist, and then after that I think about a quarter of those men said therapy didn't work. So that's a study in Australia actually, with about 2,000 men who sought therapy. It found about half of them dropped out. And then of those who dropped out, half of them said they didn't have a connection with a therapist. So if you don't have a connection with a therapist, then surely we should be asking, well, what is the therapist getting wrong? Rather than relentlessly telling men that they're the problem and they should turn up, because the fact of the matter is they did turn up. It's a bit like in fitness. Like if half the people that dropped out of not seeing a personal trainer said, I didn't get along with a personal trainer, you'd start to wonder, maybe the personal trainer is not getting this right. Maybe their training isn't suitable for such a person. And that's essentially what we're seeing in the therapeutic industry and psychological industry, where because so many therapists are women, a lot of men, they want to talk to another man who has a similar lived experience, not to mention the research and frameworks, intervention, psychological models are often developed by women and for women. So once you understand that, the high rate of men not seeking help, arguably, or not receiving adequate help is totally unsurprising. I know one study I looked at by Manchester University recently found 91% of men who died by suicide did seek help. So these are men that died by suicide, middle-aged men, and 91% of them had already sought help and they'd still died. So if more than 9 in 10 men who are seeking help, if more than 9 in 10 men who died by suicide did seek help, then surely the problem is the help didn't work. It seems crazy that people don't want to ask that question, but it's perfectly reasonable. And then of that same study, they looked at the men, and remember, these are men that killed themselves. 80% of those who had a clinical assessment were seen as low risk or no risk. Again, so think about that. Like, you're telling men you're a low risk to suicide or no risk, and 80% of them, you're telling that 80% of them are killing themselves. So there's a huge blind spot in the way in which we're helping or not helping suicidal men, and a complete disregard for what suicide actually is, which in my opinion isn't a mental health disorder primarily at all. It's a lot more complicated than that. So it's about time we stopped blaming men for their own failure and their own suffering and their own deaths, and started to take a bit more accountability ourselves, I think.
Yeah, that the number's crazy. 91%. It's astonishing to hear that figure, but obviously pointing the finger of blame is an easy thing to do, to deflect the situation.
Well, it's everywhere. We see it in all areas of men's health. Like, in just more generally speaking, like, I mean, in the UK, men are behind in health by every metric. In America, they lead in 13 of the 15 causes of death, top causes of death. They die at 1.5 times the rate as women. They have worse health across every racial, socioeconomic and ethnic group. And like, even just to be a man, like, the male sex now is the single greatest demographic factor predicting early death. Like, it couldn't be worse. And if you ever talk about men's health, the answer you so often get 9 times out of 10 is, well, men should go to the doctors more. Again, it's just the same blame. It's just men should open up, men should cry, men should go to the doctors, blah 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 blah. Like even in school, which is an issue I talk about, where again, ubiquitously boys are behind in education, behind every stage of education. And if you talk about that, it's the same old blaming narrative again, where boys should try harder, or maybe girls are just smarter. And you just would never say that about any other group that's behind in these areas. I mean, I work as a creative strategist, and I've worked for many health agencies. I've worked for the NHS, for example, and I've worked specifically to target groups like black communities, for example, share a lot of this apprehension on health is seen in black communities. So I've worked directly with the NHS to try and help those communities seek help. And if I ever went into a meeting and said anything like, oh, black people should go to the doctors more, rather than trying to sympathise with why they don't, I would definitely be fired. I remember seeing a campaign not long ago, and it said, this year, thousands of men would die from stubbornness. i.e. they're being stupid, they're not going to the doctor, and they're playing. Like, if I went in to the NHS and said, right, here's my approach, it's going to say black people, thousands of them, are going to die from stubbornness. It'd be the last day of my career, and that would be right to be fired, and we don't even consider it. And like, I watched about NHS again during COVID, because similar demographic groups were at risk to COVID. I never got asked to help men. I was helping South Indian and black communities again, but the male sex was an enormous at-risk group for many reasons, both biological and sociological, but never got asked to help them. So it's not good enough to endlessly blame men for their own poor health outcomes, and we need to start accepting a bit more responsibility and taking some action of our own, and actually putting the money where it's needed to help save these men's lives. Like, it's such a, I always think, one of the most shocking facts I've read is 15 men will die young every hour in the UK. So if this podcast lasts an hour, that's 15 men died young. Most of those are avoidable with the right healthcare, but no one wants to do anything about it.
Yeah, even just hearing those sorts of stats and hearing the responsibility constantly being deflected on men, or constantly pointing men as the perpetrators, or it doesn't matter. Even in other cases where I think I've seen you post before, and I've seen people speak about the same debate online with, men also suffer abuse and are victims too, and the rebuttal to that being, well, it's happening by the hands of other men. Like, it doesn't matter because it's from the same sex, and it's just another way to point the finger at blame.
It's definitely, even if their claim was right, it's still the wrong approach to take. But the claim isn't right. It's both morally and objectively wrong to say that. Like, the vast majority of partner abuse is perpetrated by women against men. Like, overwhelmingly, we're talking like 90%. And I see it all the time. I see it no matter, whenever you see anyone, the few times that you see them talk about male victims of abuse, it's always sort of followed shortly by, mostly by the men, and it's simply not true. Like, every time you enter the field of male victims of abuse, there's always some sort of myth. It's not quite as bad, or it's by the men, or women are doing it in self-defense, and they're all wrong. They're all wrong, and they're all things that I think will go down in history as betrayals of men that in 20 years' time we'll look back at ourselves with disgust, because it's not true. And even if it was true, even if it was by another man, doesn't make it less important. Doesn't mean the victim is any less deserving of help. Doesn't provide any solace to that victim at all. You see the same thing when you talk about men who are victims of, like, knife crime or stranger violence, you call it, where you're being assaulted by someone you don't know, typically on the street, and that is by other men. It is obviously men assaulting other men on the streets. Knife crime is men stabbing other men, particularly young men, and like black boys and young black men in particular. But I still don't think that's the right approach. Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's the same bigoted view as those who said black on black crime as a way of diminishing and waving away gang violence. But it doesn't change anything. It doesn't mean the crime hurts any less. It doesn't deserve the same attention. Like, it's just a distraction. And I really, really wish people would stop saying those things and others.
I think I saw you repost a story frame recently about, I think it was a post from a while ago, but you reposted a story frame around domestic and sexual violence, talking about it as a men's mental health issue. Talk to me a little bit about that. What's the latest on that?
Well, the frustrating thing is that there's very little research done into how domestic and intimate partner violence impacts a man's health. There is some, and it obviously correlates strongly with things like suicide. Like, I think it's about 11% of men who are being abused in the UK will consider suicide. And there's 1.5 million men being abused every year. So 11% of them are potentially at risk to suicide. So, enormous problem. But more broadly, there's been massive meta-analyses done on women's health and how that's impacted by intimate partner violence. And they found that a young woman's experiences of intimate partner violence has a greater detrimental impact on her health than smoking. Smoking, poor diet, illicit drug use, all of these pale in comparison to her experiences of intimate partner violence, not just in terms of her mental health, but quite literally her physical health is massively impacted. So we're in a situation now in the UK where we've had some progress finally in the area of men's health. We've got a men's health strategy coming out in November. And I wonder whether intimate partner violence or any form of violence against men is going to be included in that strategy. I imagine it probably won't be because it's unpopular, but it really ought to be. If you consider intimate partner violence has a greater impact on a woman's health than smoking, not having intimate partner violence in a men's health strategy would be more absurd than not having smoking in it, which of course they should both be in there. But you arrive at a point where people want to talk about men's health, but a lot of the causes of men's health, such as intimate partner violence and sexual abuse and stuff like that, they don't want to talk about. So now we live in a world where we're simultaneously talking and not talking about these things, mainly because of our political comfort level. And that's just something we've got to get over, like ASAP, because it's coming at the cost of lives. Like, your political comfort is not more important than a man's life. And that's a lesson we need to learn sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I wonder why that's the way that we view men when they're a victim as opposed to a woman. And, one's often seen more as a joke, whereas the others see him as like an epidemic. And even from just a structural bias, I used to work for the police many moons ago, and even just like from a boots on the ground perspective, if an arrest was made, it was usually a male, despite the circumstance that occurred. And if no arrest was made, often the officers would ask the male to leave, even if fault was unclear. I think, mostly in Western countries, when police respond to domestic violence calls, the male partner is more often presumed the aggressor. It's not written in stone, but it's a practical bias, I think, that is enforced.
Well, it might as well be written in stone. Like that, a lot of the policy that's guiding sort of the police training, for example, is based on violence against women. So if they go to a household where there's been a dispute, even if the man's the victim and clearly the victim, he's still arrested. So you can imagine there's probably nothing quite as bad as being a victim of abuse. You reach out for help, and then the police, when they arrive, they arrest you. I can't imagine how bad that would be. But that is ultimately how it works for most men in these relationships. And I interviewed a guy called Don Dutton, who's probably North America's leading expert in domestic violence. He told me about a story where a man was stabbed by his wife. He called the police arrive, the knife is sticking out of him, literally sticking out of him, and they take him to hospital, they get the knife removed, and then they arrest him.
No way.
So even when you've got it's a true story. Even if the knife's sticking out of you, there's the evidence, he's still the perpetrator. So and then of course we base a lot of our claims on domestic violence on those police statistics. We will say, wow, 90% of people being arrested for domestic violence are men. And it's like, yeah, because the way it works, like for the stories such as that man. So the serpent eats his own tail in that sense. And again, it's just another thing we're getting desperately wrong. But the fact of the matter is, in the UK, about 39% of domestic abuse victims are men. In America, it's more or less 50%. In Australia, I think it's about 40 to 45%. And I constantly hear headlines in Australia saying we have an epidemic of violence against women and girls. You can frame it that way if you want. But women are only about 60% of victims, and men who are the remaining 40% get nothing. Certainly not an epidemic. There was virtually no services for male victims. So you got 60% of a problem being seen as an epidemic, and then 40%, which is still a significant minority, there's nothing. No epidemic, no support services, no shelters, no funding, no nothing. That's where we've arrived. And that's what we consider progressive political discourse, which it clearly is not. And again, that's just something we're going to look back at.
Yeah. Well,
who knows, 10 years from now and be like, I can't believe we allowed that to happen.
Again, I think that's the way it's viewed. If a man's got the knife literally sticking from him and he's still seen as the perpetrator. I mean, I'd made a note of a US Department of Justice study found the male victims were far less likely to have their female partner arrested. And I think it was maybe 90% had seen somewhere that they would not report their female partner even if the violence has occurred. So again, it's no surprise that men aren't reporting it when you are hearing these kind of stories come out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, but these men have failed at every stage. Like, they're less likely to recognize abuse. So abusive behavior against men, they're less likely to say that is abuse. They're just more likely to say that's part of a relationship. And even if they are able to recognize it, they're less likely to tell anyone. So about 2.5 times less likely to tell anyone if they're being abused. And even if they do tell someone, like the police, they're less likely to be taken seriously. particularly from male officers, in fact, that the officer most likely to not file a report of abuse against a man is another man. And then even if that police officer does file a report, he's less likely to go to prosecution. And even if he does, is less likely to be found guilty. So every stage, from that recognition to disclosure to being reported to prosecution to conviction, men are falling through the cracks. And at the bottom of that, you have the whole 90% of convictions are against men, which is just a stat that any amount of critical thinking, even the most minimal amount, people understand that that's such a flawed stat for all the reasons I gave and many more besides that. But it's difficult because at the same time, a lot of the men and women who are in abusive relationships are both simultaneous victims and perpetrators, in a sense that half of violent relationships are bilaterally violent, meaning both partners are feeding into what's a cycle of violence. So that man with the knife sticking out of him, he might have been on another night violent himself, and then the following night he's back to being a victim. It's not as clean cut as, perpetrator-victim binary. So yeah, I mean, half of violent relationships are bilaterally violent, meaning they're both feeding into it. The other half, that is unilateral violence. Interestingly, women are 70% of that. So 70% of one-way violence in relationships is by women, and then 30% is by men. And then even that breaks down, and it's just very complicated, but we only ever talk about these things in sound bites and slogans and memes, and never quite good enough.
Yeah, well, I think you've probably seen it yourself online. Again, I don't know how true it was, but it was even looking at, from gay relationships from male and female, and there was often more abusive relationships and violence reported from the female gay relationship rather than the male. I don't know how much truth there was in those.
Well, the thing is, there's definitely a lot of studies that find the most violent relationships are same-sex female relationships.
Or is that because they report it more?
Maybe, potentially, that's a really great point. But then there's also a lot of violence in bisexual female relationships, which is often number one, followed by same-sex women, followed by heterosexual men, and then gay men. And you're right. If men are less likely to report, and your stats are based on reported violence, then it would make sense that women would be higher up, not necessarily because they're experiencing more violence, but because they're reporting it more often. But like I said, where we draw the line, I don't know. You can draw it in many different ways depending on how you ask the questions, but ultimately, male victims of abuse are no less important than female victims of abuse. And even if it's just 1% of abuse victims are men, they're still worth talking about. Far more than we already are, but it's obviously not 1%, it's a lot more than that. But it's difficult because domestic violence you get different results depending on how you ask the questions and who you ask and how you define abuse and when you ask them and the sort of survey you take. So it's never simple as one thing or another. It's something that requires a lot more work and research, which we just don't do. We just don't do it for male victims of abuse, but we really, really, really ought to.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially with the numbers we mentioned before in terms of the mortality rate of men killing themselves and how that number's risen over the past years. And what do you think the main levers are and why men are killing themselves?
Well, people always want a single answer to this one as well. And this is why in many ways I'm not an ideal podcast guest, because I have to give long sort of rambling answers, but I always want to start these answers by saying I don't know why that man killed himself. The sad thing about suicide is that they leave so many unanswered questions to the point where the people closest to that man don't know why he killed himself. A lot of men don't even know, and they leave behind a family that have no idea why he took his own life. So I wouldn't want to step in and be like, well, I know. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people online that claim to have the answer, not just for that man, but for all men. And they provide like a one-word answer or some sort of slogan around toxic masculinity, which is not true. But what my understanding of male suicide is that suicidal men primarily don't consider themselves as having a mental health issue at all. They don't consider themselves as being mentally unwell. They have a series of complicated issues that are sort of intersected together. A lot of it's around work or debt or joblessness or unemployment. A lot of it is around physical disability. A lot of it's around experiences of abuse or childhood sexual violence or bullying. A lot of it, like 20% of it's around family breakdown, child custody battles. Like divorced men are enormously high risk of suicide. And if you think about a man who's being divorced or fighting for his child in a family court, then I can understand why a man in that situation might not want to be here anymore. Like, you're losing everything. You're losing your family, you're losing your house, you're losing your marriage, you're losing your child, most of all. That man who's going through that and considering suicide, I wouldn't say he's mentally unwell. He's going through a really difficult moment in his life, and the support he requires obviously is mental health support, but the solution is far more than that. The solution is finding a way in which he can spend more time with his children, or a way in which we can make the divorce process a little bit easier on him, or fixing the family court system where it's not corrupt anymore. So it's easy for us to frame male suicide as a mental health issue, but the men who are suicidal don't consider it that way. They don't consider themselves as having a mental health problem. They have a variety of different problems, some of which I've mentioned and many more we haven't got time to talk about. But I have a friend called Susie Bennett, who's a male suicide researcher, and she has worked with thousands and thousands and thousands of men, more men than you can even comprehend. And she's described suicide in men as a symphony of sorrow, a bit like an orchestra, where when you listen to an orchestra play, you don't say, well, that's the violinist in the second row. The orchestra is all of the instruments at the same time. So it's the percussion, it's the piano, it's the brass, it's the woodwind, it's everything, and it's the violinist. It's not one thing, and it can't be separated into one thing. It's everything at the same time, all at once, impacting a man, and then moderated on top of that often by mental health issues, but it's not the primary cause. So no simple answers, unfortunately, as much as we like to have one, but we do know it's getting worse. In the UK, we've had our worst rates this century on male suicide. So for all this talk of male tears and men can open up, it doesn't seem to be working. In fact, it's getting worse. So we definitely need a new approach to understanding what male suicide is, and I would suggest seeing it outside the realm of mental health issues is the best way to go.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah,
I think you're right with your answer there in terms of I appreciate your honesty, George, and saying that you don't know. I think a lot of people would spare anything which will get views or spews, but the reason why I think it's important to recognize that is because, as some of my viewers will know, I went through a divorce, and within that period, one evening I stood on a bridge in New York and was very, very close to throwing myself off. And not that you would ever have a list of of least likely people to take their own lives, but I would probably think during that period of my life, people would put me pretty highly on that. But I just found myself in this position where the thought process there was no thought process. There was just a feeling of pain and a desperateness to get rid of that as well. And that's why I can understand for many men, there isn't a real lever that sometimes you can put your finger on and say that is why. It's a multifaceted issue that worryingly can happen to any of us or any of our loved ones.
I think it's something like men who are going through a divorce are 7 to 8 times more likely to end their life than women going through a divorce. And that is like an astronomically high number.
Well, it is if you look at divorces now at 50%.
Yeah, it was shocking. But think about that. Think about, you have this thing that's causing men to end their lives 8 times higher than the women going through that same thing. That thing is divorce. No one has ever asked what is going on inside this black box that's causing so many men to end their lives. Like, why is there no investigation into family courts or what's happening in divorces? Like, that's causing such astronomically high rates. We're just stuck on repeat on this idea of men can talk, men can talk, men can talk. But many men, including yourself, have talked already about divorce and how it has pushed them to suicide. Like, I have conversations with people like you every single day around divorce and what it does to men. So they are talking. They're talking very eloquently about the problems, bravely, as you have, but no one's listening to them and certainly not making changes. So if I were to ever end up in some sort of position of political power, I'd be like, well, let's look at divorce lawyers, let's look at family courts, let's see what these men are going through, let's get men and women going through divorces, and let's listen to what they've got to say, and let's change the structural conditions that are pushing so many men and women to suicide. Because we know what the associated factors are. We know it's things like child custody. We know it's things like divorce, unemployment, debt, experiences of abuse, addiction. but no one wants to talk about these things. So we remain stuck at square one, telling men to talk, but then failing to listen to the many things that they're already telling us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that I definitely felt within that time frame, and I was almost trying to, I guess, be my own case study with some of this stuff in the aftermath of just feeling incredibly lonely, which then led me into looking more around the male loneliness epidemic and how that was just panning out for men. Because I think, we know the earth isn't flat. We know that Bigfoot was a myth. We know that the man can run 100 meters under 10 seconds, but we still don't know what the effects are fully of human loneliness. And I was looking at, I think it was the Holt Smith and Leighton study with the odds rationale for dying early, and they'd concluded that air pollution was a 5% causation, obesity was 20%, excessive drinking being 30%, and then loneliness being 45%. So I think there's just that following divorce, and the male loneliness epidemic in general is just so unknown at this point as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very difficult to talk about because people seem to think it's a joke. I watched a video, came up on timeline this morning, and there was some influencer feminist woman talking to camera, and she was like, "Don't talk to me about the male loneliness epidemic, more like the male loser epidemic," followed by like a 5-minute rant about how men need to do better and how they suck and how it's their own fault they're this way. And it's like, we can't even begin to answer these questions around male loneliness, because as soon as you start to position it in an area of some sort of sympathy, you get some arsehole on social media whining about it. And it's again and again and again, you get these things like man keeping, which is all about how women are paying the biggest burden of male loneliness. So you just get endless like tirades of abuse. I remember I saw a study by Robin Dunbar around male loneliness, and he said men need to spend 2 nights a week with their friends for their mental and physical health, which is fair enough. But then you look at the comments and just the outrage and the anger towards these findings. These men are in shitty relationships, or women need to spend 7 nights a week with each other, and just no one is willing to talk about these conditions, these problems, such as male loneliness, unless it's to make fun of them. And that is such a massive part of the problem. I know I have a friend, Susie, who I mentioned earlier, she started to do an agenda on male suicide research because no one's really asking what are the big questions we need to address. She went out and has made an agenda for male suicide. So she spoke to hundreds of lived experience experts all over the world, meaning suicidal men and bereaved families. And then she spoke to about a dozen world-leading clinical experts in the area of male suicide as well. And then from that, she basically asked them, like, what are the big questions you think we need to solve to bring this number down of male suicide? And the biggest priority, which was endorsed as essential or very important by 98% of people she asked, so more or less everyone, said male loneliness, number one. That was the number one priority in terms of male suicide research. And yet, any attempt to do so often is responded to with anger, hostility, aggression, violence. So you got male suicide, which is the biggest risk to my life and your life and the lives of every young man. The number one associated factor with that being male loneliness, and we can't even talk about it. So we're deprived of the very antidote to our own pain, and it's replaced with jokes and jeers and insults instead. So often attempts to talk about loneliness are greeted with these responses, and that's a unique part of the problem that needs to be addressed as well. And I'm so tired of it. It's so disheartening to see the same comments and the same whining in every single comment section beneath any attempt to talk about male loneliness. And then people attempting to say women are the primary victim of male loneliness. It's like, it's just, you can't help but laugh sometimes. It's really bad.
Well, this imitates itself quite well, even across for some of the men's groups that I run and the retreats that we run. We always ask people within the questionnaires, they want to comment on why they've attended or the reason for attending the event. And on the previous one that we ran, 82% of men had said that they were attending through loneliness and that they didn't have friends that they could speak to. So it's overwhelming the reason or the reason why men are wanting to meet other men more, and why they're feeling low or why they're attending these events, or why there's a huge uptake in physical events as opposed to a lot of the stuff that had evolved online and digitally.
Well, Australia is the birthplace of men's sheds, if you know what that is. Men's Sheds is the most amazing organisation. It's in the UK and America and Canada and a bunch of other countries now, but it started in Australia, so hats off to you. But Men's Sheds is essentially a series of community sheds all over the country, all over the world now, that invites men who are lonely and dealing with mental health issues to come and join their shed. So it's like a workshop, and then in these sheds, men fix and build toys for local families, and it's like a win-win-win. So they're there working together, building things for local communities. The local communities benefit because they get things fixed for free. And then, of course, the health services benefit because these men finally have that sense of purpose and they're not leaning so heavily on the health system. So it's like a really great example of what's a social prescription, it's called. And so instead of having like a medical prescription, like some sort of pill, you're sent to a shed to build things for local kids, or you're sent to like a hiking group, or you're sent to an allotment, or you're sent to like a breakfast club or a talk group, like loads of these really awesome activities where men work together side by side rather than face to face like a normal therapist. And the impact that's having on men's mental health is enormous, and their physical health. It reminds me of that meme that came out ages ago where it'd be like a photo of men tinkering with a steam engine, and it would say, well, men would rather build steam engines than go to therapy. Or there'd be a photo of men enacting Roman battles, or men would rather enact Roman battles than go to therapy, or men would rather start a podcast than go to therapy. And I'm like, well, these things are therapy in many ways. These are the ways in which men feel better about themselves by going into a field and pretending like they're the Roman legion, or creating a steam engine, or creating a podcast, joining a band, going on a walking groups. Like, all these things are really beneficial to men. And again, those are mocked and sneered at as if they're doing these things rather than going to therapy. But the people that are sneering at it, I'm like, you don't understand, that is therapy. There's a great TV show in the UK called The Detectorists, where it's basically men who go into a field and with metal detectors and look for like buried treasure. They never found anything. But it wasn't about the fact they didn't find anything. It was about that they were together doing something that they loved, and that sense of camaraderie. So I am a big fan of social prescriptions, ahead of putting people on antidepressants for sure. And I'm glad to see more and more of these charities popping up all over the country, particularly Men's Sheds, which started in Australia. So that's some of the good news, I think.
I actually saw down on Burleigh Beach the other evening as I was enjoying my frozen yogurt. There was guys on different parts of the beach, all with these metal detectors, looking around on the beach in the arse end of the night, and a couple of them were coming closer and closer together. And there's a girl that I was with, and they were like, she's like, they're never going to find anything. There's no chance they'll find anything. And they came closer and closer, and I was like, they've just found probably the most important thing that they'll find all night, and that was each other. Because then they stopped and had a conversation for exactly 15, 20 minutes. And I think even down to like a grassroots level, I think there's a lot of telling boys not to be boys anymore, not to be out in the mud or in the trees or lighting the fires or doing whatever. I think that's a multifaceted reason why that's happening. But I might be wrong, but I think just referencing back to the shed scenario, was part of the reason that was successful is based on the body language of men as well, in terms of how men best communicate side by side rather than front on. And that's why also in-person therapy doesn't work as well for men. And when men have conversations face to face, we have the bladed stance, the body language is a little bit maybe more aggressive than it would be for a woman. And that's why men sometimes, when we're in those scenarios face to face, don't open up as much as if we were side by side with someone.
Well, there's loads of reasons. There's loads of differences in that area. One of them, he pointed out that men typically like to be shoulder to shoulder, side by side, rather than face to face, in terms of even the positioning of their bodies. But men also like to be in group therapy more often. They don't want to be one-to-one either. So side by side in groups, they like to listen to other men talk about their problems first as a way of role modeling and understanding, how do I talk about these things. They like to have it quite flat in hierarchy. They like all the men to be equal. They don't like to have, the therapist is the one that's in charge and I'm the client. And they like it not to be state controlled. They like it to be more community based. They like it to be productive. They like to be solution orientated. Typically, it's like this typical thing where women want to be heard and men want solutions. And then you have the archetypal couple where a woman's trying to talk to the man and she just wants to be heard, and he's endlessly providing solutions, which she doesn't want because she just wants to be heard. And he's frustrated because she's not taking the solutions, and she's frustrated because she doesn't feel heard, which she isn't. So there's just different ways in which men talk and want help and want to be helped. And those are just a few, and it goes on and on and on. Also, like the physical activity element of it's quite good. Like I've been to like fundraisers for big charities in the UK, one of them called Strong Men, which is a charity for bereaved men, particularly dads who've lost children, and they just go hiking up mountains. And I've met some of the most ultra masculine men. There's one guy called Chunk who was just as you'd expect, a huge, big, burly, bold guy who I think he lost his child.
Wasn't the guy from the Goonies?
Yeah, sadly not. No, he was just like this ultimately masculine man. He never talked about losing his child. He never opened up, never showed vulnerability. He went on one walk up a mountain with strong men, and he said he was like bawling his eyes out by the time he got to the top. And now he leads the walks. He's not like a member. He's like leading the walk. He's one of the guys that role models to other men what it's like to be vulnerable and what it's like to be to get care and to speak about your pain. And I think the physical activity element of that's really important. Like in my professional life, I work as a documentary filmmaker and I interview a lot of people, and I can tell straight away who's more comfortable talking to me like this in an interview and who's not. And for most people, if you just give them a physical activity to do, like cooking or chopping some vegetables or driving a car, it instantly makes them so much more open. So like you might be talking to a male friend of yours, asking them to tell you about something they're going through, and they might be standoffish. But if you like, oh, let's go for a drive or a walk, just being positioned in that side by side sort of format and having some sort of physical activity to take the edge off the face-to-face element has a massive impact. So just taking that conversation into a car, going for a drive, I promise you'll have a massive impact and you'll get a lot more out of that person in terms of sharing and disclosure. So these are all things that are really worth investigating further. But because the psychological industry, as we said earlier, is 80% women or 85% women really, no one's asking these questions. Like I get contacted all the time by young men studying psychology, and they're like, I'm the only man in this class. I'm the only man.
I did psychology at university, and there's probably 85% female.
Yeah, well, some people there's like a class of like 30, and they're the only one. And like you can imagine how that happens. If that's happening across the whole country or world, you can imagine, which is unsurprising, we'll end up in a situation where men feel like they're not being seen, and the intervention strategies and frame are not working for them. It's totally unsurprising. But the mere mention of that, you're going to start to get those angry responses and hostility. So I think there's important questions like, how can we change the way we help everyone? I get a lot of women contacting me like, I want to go on a dog walking group. I want to join a men's sheds. I want to do this. And it's like, you should. A lot of women benefit from this too. Like our view of therapy is so limited in the sense that it's clinical environment, one-to-one, typically talking to a woman. And I feel like we're all missing out by not exploring more options than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder how much of when men are doing these sorts of things, like I've had a lot of guys open up when we've done, bushcraft, or we do
bushcraft,
different techniques on the water, or we do hiking, or we do certain workouts and stuff. And I think it gives guys purpose, which I think a lot of the time we just tell men make more money, and that's the solution to having purpose in life. And it's just for most or a lot of men, it doesn't fit. And again, I've had lots of women message me about coming to the events, because the majority of women that I speak to are super supportive, because men's mental health affects everyone, women as well. Women have brothers, sons, fathers, uncles. It affects every family of a man is struggling. So I think there's a lot of great women who support, especially some of the work that I do within the men's space. But then at the same time, there's a minority of really loud women who don't. And I mean, I even got stuck on this, and I hate it now, is that I used to pre-qualify myself sometimes to speak about men's issues, because there was small cohorts of people who were making like Reddit forums about me and saying I'm a red flag because I was operating men's mental health weekends. So those kind of conversations still exist, unfortunately.
I'm surprised. I can't find anything like that about me on Reddit, which I'm always surprised by. Maybe it's underground, but
maybe yours is in the Facebook groups, always on things like tea and those kind of things.
Well, maybe, but I understand why people are very apprehensive around talking about men with any sort of kindness or care. Like our conversation around men's issues is sort of stuck around pointing out internalized issues around being toxic or personal failings towards not going to the doctor, which is nowhere near good enough. And any attempt to talk about men as suffering beyond that, particularly from structural causes, like I meant, like family courts, you're going to start to get those little pathetic WhatsApp whispering groups that are basically trying to stop you from talking, ironically. It's like men can talk, but not about that. And yeah, that's just such a big part of the problem that is just slowing down the conversation and leading to so much like misery and death. And it needs to be, I mean, I've tried to set up many men's groups, and not so often they get shouted down and cancelled before they've even started. I went to a talk yesterday and met Warren Farrell, who's like the godfather of this space, and he was like the world's leading male feminist. He left feminism and set up the men's movement, and since then his life's been very difficult. And there's like videos online about him trying to speak to Toronto University, for example, and there's people like literally barricading the door, stopping men from going to see him talk. And like, this is man, I know him personally, he's one of the most kindest, wholesome men you could ever possibly meet. There's no way he's a misogynist of any kind. He loves women, and like I said, he was like the world's leading male feminist, so he's got the credentials, but it's never enough. And I remember watching this Toronto University video where protesting against him coming to speak, barricaded the entrances, like yelling like Nazi salutes, all this horrific stuff going on. And then one guy got turned away, like aggressively turned away. And then the camera operator ran up to him and, why are you here? What is it you came to learn? And he said, 2 of my men killed themselves and I wanted the peace of knowing why they did it. So these are the conversations you're depriving men of, like depriving them of the peace of knowing why 2 of his friends killed himself. So that's the price of his endless whining and people banging pots and yelling and pulling fire alarms. And it's impacting everyone. And yeah, it impacts women too. I understand, like you mentioned, like there's always this performative virtue signaling that comes before these conversations where someone has to be like, wow, we doesn't mean we're not going to do more for women and girls, and helping men is good for women too, and blah, 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 blah. And those things are true and they are important, but it's always frustrating when people feel like that's the first thing they need to say, because the simple truth is that men are inherently deserving of these conversations, regardless of whether they have a secondary benefit to women, which they do. And for people to be endlessly framing this conversation as a benefit to women and girls, I feel like you're undermining yourself long term, because the reality is that men deserve them themselves inherently. So that's what I mean, another balancing act. How do you get it right? And I don't even necessarily think that's what women, if by saying it's a benefit to women and girls too, if that's done as a means of appealing to women's interests, I don't agree with that either. Like, women's interests are aligned with men. Like, women care about men. They're not looking to benefit from this. They're not asking. I get contacted every day by women thanking me. I've never had a comment, never had a message of a woman saying, how do I benefit from this? Like, I've never had that. I've only ever had women saying, how can I help my dad or my brother or my son? They're not interested. They're not as self-interested as people like to present them. They're incredibly selfless, caring people, and they care about these issues for the same reason as men. So we don't need to present it as benefit to women and girls too. Certainly not primarily, although that obviously is an important thing, and I agree, it is a benefit to them, but it's frustrating, this dance that everyone does to endlessly appeal to women's so-called interests.
Yeah, you talked about the balance there. Do you think modern feminism and men's advocacy can genuinely coexist, or are they just fundamentally at odds?
I just don't know. I mean, this is obviously a conversation that's ongoing behind the scenes. I mean, it really depends on who we're talking about. Like, which feminist organizations are we speaking about? Some of them absolutely are welcome and needed, especially for men, but some of them are inherently problematic and have done some horrific things towards men. Like, here's one example is the National Organization for Women, which is the biggest feminist organization in North America, probably even the world. They have a sordid history of blocking shared custody laws right across America. So there's an effort now in a divorce that you have the presumption of shared custody. So the father and mother going into court, they're treated as equal. The judge presumes that they get joint custody, and then from that presumption, both parents build their case to have shared custody or primary custody, whatever, which is the right thing to do. We should presume that both parents are equally important to the child under law, but that only exists in a few states, like maybe 3 or 4, and that's because one reason is that the National Organization for Women have spent decades and decades and decades blocking those bills, protesting those bills, protesting against equality in many ways, and that cannot be reconciled within the men's movement, and that cannot be accepted in any means. That is just objectively morally wrong, and criticizing that movement is necessary. And that was the National Organization for Women. I mentioned Warren Farrell. That was the organization he was part of. He was
really
he remains the only man ever elected to the board of directors for the now 3 times. That's never happened again. And he left because he couldn't believe that they were petitioning against shared custody. He was like, how could you be petitioning against not only equality but the best interests of a child? So he left, and he left feminism. Karen DeCrow, who was the president of the Now, left for the same reason. Like, both of them were thrown out because they wanted equality. So there's one example of many I can give you of an area of feminism that has no place in the modern world. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't make me misogynist at all. That's just the reality.
But I think that's the fear that a lot of men have who speak out about it now, is that they are called, the toxically masculine. But I know we're kind of short on time, George, as well. But you mentioned about the left there, and I know that you're you're a leftist men's advocate, if I'm correct, and from what I can tell, but which might be deemed as quite a rare hybrid to some people.
Yeah.
But from your point of view, what are the right and the left getting wrong in your opinion?
I think they get it wrong in opposite ways, although I do find the right are doing better. Like, often the newspapers and politicians that are talking about these issues are on the right. So there's some interesting policy coming to Westminster being brought in by conservative politicians, and it's impossible to ignore that there's no one in government or in the Labour Party there to support it. They're not there, and that's intentional. But I feel like the left are the ones that are perpetrating these ideas that men are inherently problematic, and any issues they experience are a result of that issue. This idea of toxic masculinity and personal failings and internalized problems, and the idea that gender is entirely socially constructed, and therefore any issue related to gender is the doing of the man himself. That is mostly left, not to mention a lot of the ideological barriers around feminism and the patriarchy and all these other nonsense political theories are from the left mostly. However, the right seem to go the opposite direction. They seem to think that there's no such thing as a socialization of gender, that gender is entirely biological, which it isn't. And in the area of like male victims of abuse, for example, there's an interesting phenomenon where male victims fall through the gaps on both sides, because the right, for example, are very much interested in family values. And within the area of family values, the idea of a male victim of abuse is not particularly welcome. Whilst on the left, we talk about violence against women, where women are the perpetual victim, where the male victim is also not welcomed. So in that instance, and in many others, vulnerable men fall through the gaps on both sides, and no one talks about them. So that makes me quite rare, where not many people talk about these issues. Fewer still talk about them on the left, and then fewer still talk about them on the left outside of feminist frameworks. So it's really just me and a few other people doing it, and hopefully that will change. But yeah, it's quite rare to see any support from the left, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate the work that you're doing, George, and you're someone that I've wanted to speak to for a long time. I think the work that you're doing within the men's mental health space is second to none. And I'm just really grateful that you're having these conversations, these uncomfortable situations, and being brave through them as well. But who do you think Who do you think men can also look to for, as champions or role models, and listening to some of these conversations that are being had?
Everything in moderation, I think. So I think Warren Farrell, he's written some amazing books. He's written The Boy Crisis, which is probably the first one you should read. Richard Reeves is not quite as brave as Warren and comes at it from more of a policy sort of angle. He wrote Of Boys and Men. I think between those two books, you're on good footing, mixing a bit of my content perhaps. But those are the two books I would recommend straight away. And I met them both yesterday, actually. I was hanging out with both Richard and
really?
Warren. Yeah. I mean, it was a small world, but I was at a documentary film festival where Warren was showing one of his films, and I was chatting to him, and bloody Richard Reeves is right there as well. So I was like, wow, holy trinity. So, yeah, I think those are there's just not enough literature, though, I don't think. There needs to be a lot more, but those two you're in safe hands, I think, with both of them.
Awesome. Well, George, where can people also find more of your content or find more of you online as well following this conversation?
Well, I want to get onto YouTube more. I'm putting more time into doing videos. I'm on a bit of a break from YouTube, but when I come back, I want to do more video essays. So in 6 months' time, YouTube. But currently, Instagram is still the center point of TheTinMen. So if you go on Instagram /TheTinMen, that's where all my content lives primarily. But I'm also, on X and Reddit, Discord, and YouTube. But Instagram is the starting point, I think.
Well, I look forward to seeing some more of that long form content, George, and I'll hold you accountable to that as well.
Yeah, please do, because I really want to do it. I think Instagram's had its day for me, and I want to do more long form video content, to be fair. So yeah, please do.
Awesome. And I really appreciate your time. And again, thank you for doing everything that you do as well, George. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to you too.
Thank you very much.